Hi, this is Larrabee, and the book that I read for Models of Leadership is something different from the list of recommended readings on the course list. And I decided to take advantage of the fact that I recently got a new job as an instructional designer at Champlain College to do some more deep diving into how what we're learning in class relates specifically to my future job and my current job. So the book that I picked was called Visual Thinking for Information Design by Colin Ware. And the reason I picked it was that it talks a lot about our perceptions, our attitudes, and how we navigate the world visually, and how our brains turn what we see into a learning experience or a memory or something like that. So the section of the book was broken into about 5 sections, and it got very technical. A lot of the book was explaining research studies about optics and nerves and cognition and parts of the brain. The first part was really about the mechanics of optics, cognition, and space, just sort of how we find ourselves in the world. The second section was about color, rods and cones, perception, a lot of, again, detail in terms of the way our eyes work and why, how light is important, why, some lighting affects people differently, or why some colors affect people differently. And then layout and space, just sort of how things are arranged and how that makes us feel and how we interpret information based on how they're presented. And then it went into a section about words and narrative content, just including how much information we take in, and beyond just shapes and colors, the fact that we're constantly reading, even though we know we're not actually actively reading, but we're constantly taking in words and narrative content that increases the cognitive load. And then finally, there was a meaning interpretation section, which was really the application of how all of this can be used. I wanted to start with a quote that I thought was really interesting. When we are awake with our eyes open, we have the impression that we see the world vividly, completely, and in detail. But this impression is dead wrong. And I thought that was really great because it starts off with examining your perceptions and your assumption about your perceptions, and really just breaking that down on a scientific level to examine what are you really seeing. And there was another wonderful quote that said, "The understanding that we only sample the visual world on a kind of need-to-know basis leads to a profoundly different model of perception." And so in addition to the fact that we don't really see everything, we have selective seeing, which sort of is informed by our priorities, our bias, our experience, and it actually affects the way we see and the cognition and the processing that goes on in our brains as to how we take that visual input and turn it into information that informs our behavior, our conversations, and our attitudes about things. And so this was a good example that we only process details in the center of our visual field. We pick up information by directing our fovea using rapid eye movements. And so these images were a really interesting example of sort of what we actually see and how much we actually see, and that we really zero in on what's important. And for, in terms of what we've been reading in class, I think that there's when you're not invested in something, and when you don't understand why something is important, it doesn't become important for you to focus on it. And so I thought a lot about how you can convey the importance of things and the vision about things to people so that they understand its importance and its context, which then justifies the time and the cognition that they need to actually see it. So they have to know it's important. They have to know why it's important to even see it at some level. And at the edge of our visual field, we can barely see someone standing next to us. So we really have tunnel vision in so many ways. And this was another interesting element about focusing on the atypical. Our brains are designed to recognize patterns and threats. And so when something is what we consider out of place or out of line, our eyes go right to it. And so in this example, our eyes go right to the big bold text of Anne or Treisman's because it's sideways. And so on a very basic level, our reptilian brains are designed to notice and in some ways bias anything that is outside of the norm. And I thought about this in relation to diversity in the workplace and how we approach that, and just the fact that the cognitive load that we get when we're visualizing the landscape of the workplace is something that is informing us on levels that we don't even know. And so I thought that was interesting, that we're wired to recognize bias, and part of human development is understanding that bias, understanding the context of it, and sort of working through it and moving through it productively, especially when it comes to leadership and as a manager, as a leader, to recognize that things that stand out, or people who stand out, or elements that stand out are exceptional and need to be brought in some way that recognizes their differences and their value for being different, and not tries to assimilate them into everything else. So there was a little bit of a social element to that as well. The other piece that I thought was particularly interesting was talking about cognitive load. And this is something that as an information scientist, I've dealt with a lot. And as an instructional designer, I will be dealing with a lot. But in any workplace, people are bombarded with information constantly, and our ability to make decisions, our ability to communicate is impacted based on our cognitive load, how much we can handle. And so here's a good example from the book that it takes more work to look at this picture of Marilyn Monroe because we have to put it together. So identifying this picture is harder when it's inverted. So it's forcing us to do more work, and it doesn't feel like it because it's so intuitive. It's just so subconscious. It's not really something we think about, like, okay, I have to look at the mouth. I have to see if it's upside down or not. Are the eyes upside down or right side up? So we're not walking through that. But our brains are constantly working through that visual information. So in terms of workplace, if you have a cluttered workplace, if you have a busy workplace, if you have a workplace that has lots of visual information that people are bombarded with, that may affect people's performance and how easy it is to overwhelm them. This is another thing. I personally love to color code things because that keeps me organized, and it also helps convey a system of organization in a team. And so one thing I found particularly interesting was about color coding and meaning. And this is a very, very specific example of the detail of the color theory part of the book. In the design of color codes, the two primary considerations must be visual distinctness to support visual search operations and learnability, so that particular colors come to stand for particular entities. When learnability is the issue, it's important to use the unique hues first, red, green, yellow, and blue, followed by other colors that have relatively consistent names, pink, brown, gray, and purple. So it seems so obvious because we see hundreds of these a day, but when you're creating a visual, the thing that you want to draw attention to should be in red or orange or a bright color. And then the things that are less important should be in less important colors. And that just seems so obvious to all of us, but really thinking about that and making those intentional decisions helps people manage their cognitive load. It helps convey information, and it helps you as a leader communicate more effectively to a team, just knowing that people's brains are working on all of this in some way. And so this was really interesting. When we conduct a visual search for an object having a particular color, our brains tune our visual system so that the neurons sensitive to that hue get louder. They need to shout louder than neurons tuned into other colors. There are, however, limits to this capability. The strong pop-out effect depends both on the other colored objects in the scene and the background color. And this was an example that if I say, look for something yellow in these decorations here, that means that the yellow is automatically just going to pop out at you because that's what you're looking for. And so this seems very obvious, but I think that looking at this and examining this with these lenses in terms of how you see yourself in the world, how you interact with others, and how you how you interpret the world in order to make effective decisions. I think that's a really important element. So some of the takeaways I have are, again, just, I've said this before, but manage or to examine your perceptions and assumptions and be aware of what overwhelms you visually. Be aware of what overwhelms you in general. But in this book, it specifically talked about visual content and being aware of things that are overstimulating or that you need to have stimulating. You need to have visual stimulation. Just thinking about that and being mindful about that. Using color and design mindfully. So again, that going back to that example of like red on the map, if you want to draw attention to something, really using the brightest colors you can. And I think about this in terms of how I dress, because I'm often dressing in very bright colors. And I realize that often happens when I don't feel heard at work. And it was just one of those aha moments where I was like, I'm dressing in bright colors because I can't speak up. So I have to be bright. It was a really interesting moment. And not everyone uses the same visual lenses. And so some people are visual, some people are not as visual. And so giving information visually isn't going to work for everybody. And so even though there are all these considerations, it's also good to consider that not everybody has, even though all of us work in this way and that we're wired for this kind of visual and neurological functioning, in terms of preference and communication, we're not all wired that way. And finally, some more workplace applications. Know how people like to receive information. Knowing how your team likes to process information, especially complex information, is very helpful so that you can ask whether or not they need charts or narrative or how much visual they need, and trying to tailor the information that you're trying to convey to your team and make it as accessible to as many people as possible. To be aware and empathetic to the cognitive load. And again, because of COVID, this is sort of on everybody's radar, but we're all overwhelmed. And so not overwhelming people or trying to take away things that could overwhelm people from a presentation. If you have a presentation or if you have a report, not putting lots of like fancy clip art on things just because it's a cognitive load. Using color and design mindfully. I talked about that in the previous slide. And this was scientifically proven that putting things in black and white is the best way for people to see things. We've all heard the expression, there it is, and it's right there in black and white. And it's because that high contrast is something that we immediately respond to. So thinking about that and thinking about how you arrange information and the colors that you use, but also the contrast that you use to convey how important something is. And of course, the meaning of colors, images, and symbols, especially if you're addressing a diverse group, because, in one culture, red means one thing, and in another culture, red means another. And so it's important to know if you are using color or symbols, what those mean, and to really be sensitive to everybody's perception about how those are interpreted. And so that was the book. It was very interesting. It was very scientific, but it gave me a lot to think about in terms of our assumptions and what we take in and how that makes us potentially better leaders.